Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you to this program tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking and Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone or go to the LinkedIn Live video feed, the link to which I'll now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone and say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guest is University Professor Dr. Julio Mendívil, Chair of Ethnomusicology at the University of Vienna. Professor Mendívil is joined by University Professor Dr. Philip Auslander, Professor of Performance Studies and Popular Musicology at Georgia Tech. We are also pleased to be joined by Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Among the literature we will discuss tonight is Professor Mendivil's newly published article, The Body of Flor Pucarina, Guayano Gender Stereotypes and Basic Structures of Violence in Peru, as well as Professor Auslander's 2021 book, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona.
Muchísimas gracias, queridísimo público, por ese chaparrón de aplausos en este 25 de noviembre. ¿Ah? Y para el director general también del Instituto Nacional de Cultura, que también está presente con nosotros. Otro chaparrón de aplausos, claro que sí, ¿o no? Eso es, ¿ah? Claro que sí, está sentadito ahí, se esconde, pero se le ve, ¿ah? Porque ahí no va a estar. Desde cuando te conocí,
Welcome, Professor Mendívil.
Hello, thank you for inviting me for this show this night. I'm very happy to be here.
Professor, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in ethnomusicology?
This is a short history. I come from Peru, from Lima, and Lima, as the capital of Peru, is a Western influenced city. And I grew up in Lima, listened to popular music from the USA and from UK. I was a fan of progressive rock music, and I began to play the guitar. And when I formed my first group, we thought that we could mixture the traditional music from Peru with the rock music, with the progressive rock music. And so I began to interest me in the music from the Andes. And then I fell in love with the music and abandoned the playing music and became an ethnomusicologist who worked on traditional music from the Andes. I would say traditional music and popular music from the Andes. This is my focus in my research.
Okay. Philip Auslander, I don't know if you're able to turn on your microphone or not. Can you hear us? Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So
Hello.
Professor Auslander, would you please tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in performance studies and popular musicology?
Okay, well, maybe I'll turn on my video, although I don't know. Yeah, all right. The background is unassuming. Yeah, well, my background actually is in theater primarily. That's where my interest in performance comes from. And but I've sort of gravitated out from theater per se to many other types of performance, which is why I affiliate myself with performance studies rather than theater studies at this point. And one of the main areas besides theater and performance art and stuff like that that I've addressed is music. And this is partly just because I love music, I'm a fan, and also because I did feel at a certain point, quite a few years ago by now, that performance studies wasn't really looking at musicians as performers, which seemed a little strange to me since musicians are self-evidently performers. On the one hand, on the other hand, traditional musicologists, at least, not necessarily ethnomusicologists, but traditional musicologists tended not to take too much interest in performance either by musicians. And so I thought that, one thing I could try to do is to kind of fill in that gap. And so that's how I've come to be interested in this.
Fantastic. So Professor Mendívil, can you tell us what exactly is ethnomusicology and why does your scholarship cite Professor Auslander so much? What do performance studies and popular musicology have in common with your research?
Yeah, we define music in ethnomusicology as sound, as behavior, and as concept. And for this reason, for us, music is not only the musical structure, but also the way we act when music is playing, when we listen to the music. And for us, music is also what we think about the music. And for this reason, for us, as Professor Auslander says, performance is a very important point, because when we play music or when someone plays music, it's not only the musician who is performing, but also the audience, which is there, is interacting with the player. And in this form, we have performance which is built by different persons with different, I would say, different, parts of the performance, who is playing, who is organizing something in the background, for example, or he is dancing to the music or listen to the music and so forth. And for this reason, for us, it's important to know what musicians do, but also what people do when they are listening or dancing to the music, and also what they think about the music they listen to.
Fantastic. So this brings us to our first roundtable. What is a quote unquote body and what is a quote unquote musical persona? Can they be confused with one another? On page 138 of the article written by Professor Mendívil, The Body of Flor Pucarina, whom we saw dancing and singing at the beginning of the show, he writes, and this is my translation from the original Spanish, quote, "It's not easy to speak about bodies, especially when our discipline, ethnomusicology, teaches us to hide our very own body behind a subjective discourse. Yet every subject comes with a body attached to it. That of the Peruvian Huayno singer Flor Pucarina, upon transforming herself into a cultural symbol of the Huanca people, it had to be domesticated and restored to a subordinate form, one allied to the manner of heteronormative reproduction of late-stage capitalism, end quote. And on page 101 through 102 of Musical Personae, an article written by Professor Auslander in 2006, he writes, quote, "From this vantage point, it does not necessarily follow that simply because the verb to perform demands a direct object, that the object of performance must be a text such as choreography, a dramatic script, or musical work. Many other things can be understood as performative constructs. Personal identity may be seen as something one performs. For instance, one can speak of performing a self in daily life just as readily as one speaks of performing a text in a theater or concert hall. In short, the direct object of the verb to perform need not be something. It can also be someone, an identity rather than a text. I posit that in musical performance, this representation of self is a direct object of the verb to perform. What musicians perform, first and foremost, is not music, but their own identities as musicians, their musical personae," end quote. So, professors, starting with Professor Mendívil, what does it matter that Flor Pucarina's quote-unquote body is confused with her quote-unquote musical persona?
I wanted to begin with a short introduction of Flor Pucarina. She was a very important singer from Peru between the 60s and the 80s, and she played traditional music from the Central Andes in Peru. It's an ethnic group called Huanca. And for this reason, the music she sang is called Música Huanca, from music from the Huanca region in Peru. And she was very popular, but also she was a controversial personality because she broke with a lot of gender stereotypes. And for this reason, she was loved and admired by people, but also criticized from a moral perspective because she didn't behave like a good woman in the Peruvian society. And these critiques against her lifestyle confused many times the private life by Leonor Chavez Rojas, that was the real name, and the musical persona, Flor Pucarina, which was a figure she developed for the stage when she sang and when she played music with other musicians. And I think it's very important to differentiate the real person from the person on the stage, which is communicating with the audience in order to suggest a kind of fictive persona or a kind of image, if you want. And for this reason, I would say many people confuse the real person with the musical persona. And I think this differentiates this concept of musical persona allows us to separate both spheres, the private life of Leonor Chavez from the fictive persona which Flor Pucarina performed on the stage. And for this reason, I found really productive and really, I would say, meaningful this concept for my research.
Okay, Professor Auslander, do you want to chime in? What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, um, yeah, I completely agree with the point about the two things being confused frequently, the musical persona and the performer as a private person, so to say. And I think there's actually a strong desire on the part of audiences to believe that when they're seeing someone perform, or a musician perform, they're somehow getting a look at the real person. And the idea that you're not, or that you can't assume that you are, I think is frustrating to a lot of people. But I also want to point out, this is a point that I've made, but many other people have made as well, that um, the relationship between, or the implied relationship between the musical persona and the real person. I don't actually like the phrase real person myself, because the musical persona is a real person, but its reality is confined to a specific context. It is real in that context, just as the person off stage is real in other contexts. But anyway, that's not, we'll leave that aside. That the point I wanted to make is that the implied relationship between the real person and the musical persona varies a lot according to, for example, the genre of music. So, for example, in the singer-songwriter genre, Joni Mitchell and Carole King and people like that, the implication is that the musical persona is to be understood as more or less equivalent to the real person. Whereas obviously in other contexts, or in other genres or other types of performance contexts, it's much clearer, or it's more foregrounded, that the persona is a fictional or more artificial or whatever construct. So this is partly about what audiences want, and I do think audiences have a strong desire to think they're seeing the real person. But on the other side, I think it also has a lot to do with the way.
Professor Auslander, I think your microphone went off. Try that once more, maybe. Does that help at all? I think we're not, I think your microphone's on, but we're not hearing you. I'm sorry. We'll keep working on that. Professor Mendívil, maybe I can go back to you. Oh, and I wanted to read in the meantime, we have John Vondervert, excuse me if I mispronounce your last name, writes, there's an idea that music doesn't exist unless there is something that interprets the music. There is a reciprocity that gives each element its existence: music, performer, audience. And Professor Lino Rivera writes, I agree with Professor Auslander's description of music performance. Sorry, Phil. I don't know what to tell you. Sorry, Phil.
If he goes out and come in again,
yeah, maybe you can.
I won't say that I completely agree with this idea by Professor Auslander that there is a link between the real person and the musical persona, and I also think that a very important point for the authenticity on the stage is that you are believable when you are performing on the stage, and this is, I think, the point or the reason why people think a musical persona on the stage is 100% the same person in the real world. In his book, Professor Auslander speaks about musical frame, for example. Every musical genre has some topics or some elements which are very important for the representation of personality. And he speaks also about the self representation of the person, and this self representation should be authentic for the audience. And for this reason, it is very common that performers try to show themselves as authentic on the stage, but this authenticity is a kind of authenticity for the audience and not the real person in the everyday life, you know.
Professor Auslander, I think we have you back. Do you want to add anything to that? Oh no, I think we lost you again. That's technology. That's today's technology. And Professor Mendívil, can I ask you about the connection then of oh, you can hear us, Professor Auslander writes. Okay. Oh, and we have a message from Christina Thomas. This thought on audience is often brought up in regards to indigenous musicians. It's always an idea that we need to always be in our persona of Native American music performers and want us to be in regalia to be considered to be quote unquote authentic, or questioning if we produce new music, how that is not traditional but contemporary. We cannot separate the two because we are musicians, performers, dancers, etc. Thank you very much, Christina Thomas. Professor Auslander, do you want to try that once more?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah, for some reason my computer keeps defaulting to the wrong settings. Okay. I feel a little bit out of it. What are you asking?
So yeah, again, we're talking about Professor Mendívil. He brought up your concept of framing, and I believe of keying, right, in which, so that in order to be authentic, then the musician, and Christina Thomas just brought up how as Native American music performers, in order to be considered authentic, they have to be in their regalia, and they have to be representing what pretty much other people think they should see in order to be authentic. So if they're seeing Native American musician performers, they're going to look a certain way. And I believe that gets into what we'll talk about in a moment about stereotypes. But tell us about this concept of framing and how Professor Mendívil was saying today it gets ever closer to what you don't like to call real person. In order to be authentic, it has to be as if this person is completely lives this theater life on the street.
Yeah, I actually think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And again, I'm always going to insist that I think it depends on genre or on the particular context. For example, there are certain genres of music. So hip hop comes to mind, country music comes to mind, where seemingly there's a premium placed on the idea that the musical persona is the same person as the real person, and that real person has certain cultural and life experience, right, or a certain identity in the real world. So for example, in country music, you're supposed to be American, you're supposed to be Southern, you're supposed to be working class in origin and all of that. But there's a very interesting, I'm sorry, I have to think about if I can remember the author's name now, but there's an article on this that I refer to frequently, in which the author makes the point that, and I think it's a very interesting point, that the authenticity of the country musician does not necessarily reside in the match between that person's biography and what a country musician is supposed to be, right? Because there are plenty of counterexamples. I mean, Keith Urban, for example, is not American, et cetera, et cetera. But this author, whose name I can't remember right now, makes the point that the authenticity resides in the performer's willingness to play that role, right? That's the connection. It's not necessarily that the person really is this, but the fact that they're willing to enact that role, wear the cowboy hat, et cetera, conform in certain ways, or at least in certain degrees, to audience expectation. is sort of where the authenticity resides. And I think that's an interesting point.
Fantastic. Before we move on to our next roundtable, Professor Mendívil, I wanted to, perhaps if you could explain to us more about Flor Pucarina and what happened, this whole story that made you want to write about this, because you say that she was treated differently than a man who was of the same, who's still alive today, another performing artist who differs in nothing except that he's a man, pretty much. And this man was treated differently in every respect because he was performing, he was doing what, according to Peruvian society, you say, was expected of a man. Can you tell us about this whole story? Tell us about this whole scandal that erupted around the body of Flor Pucarina.
The point is, Flor Pucarina, that 1887, and 30 years after, a journalist published an article about her, calling her a prostitute and a drunkard, because she behaved not like a normal woman for the Catholic Peruvian society, but as a prostitute, because she drank a lot and she had a free sexual life for a very conservative society. And this article is contains a lot of insults to Flor Pucarina, because she is also a cultural icon for the Huanca region, and this person was or not agreed with this level of the reception of Flor Pucarina as a cultural hero, due to the fact that she was not a right woman in the Peruvian society, and and I was analyzing why this person criticized the personal life of these performers, because everyone is free to select the lifestyle she or he wants, but in a very conservative society like Peru, to try to be free as a woman in the 60s, in the 70s, was a sin, it was really a problem. And for this reason, she, I would say, she's condemned in this article as a bad element for the Peruvian society, who cannot represent the Huanca society. And I was trying to analyze this point, why the journalist attacked Flor Pucarina's, or I would say Leonor Rojas' life, confusing the real person with the person which she represented on the stage. And for this reason, I took this concept by Professor Oslenda, because I found this was really productive to use it in order to separate these spheres. As Professor Slender says, it's really complicated which links existed between between the real person and the performance on the stage, but nobody is really authentic on the stage, because we are performers when we are on the stage, and we are representing a role, a figure, and we are playing for the audience, and this differentiation was very important for me to show how how confusing these levels bring these journalists to form of discrimination and to symbolic sexual violence in the Peruvian society.
Fantastic. So that, as we saw that a little bit, unfortunately, grainy image of low quality that I was showing is a statue of Flor Pucarina that was erected in her hometown. And as Professor Mendívil will show us, this statue represents some kind of body that Flor Pucarina clearly was not. It represents an immaculate woman who represents all of the best or the most accepted of that Catholic society Professor Mendívil is talking about. So now we're going to learn about that symbolic violence he's talking about, how these people who loved her even would violate her rights to be the person she wanted, the woman, I should say, she wanted to be. So this brings us to our roundtable number 2. We have all heard that music promotes peace. Can music really promote violence? On page 137 of The Body of Flor Pucarina, Professor Mendívil writes, and this is my translation from the original Spanish, quote, "The furious article written in 2017 about Flor Pucarina by journalist Daniel M. Chavez, for that reason, is not only a slap in the face to the long-deceased singer, it is, moreover, an invitation to perpetuate symbolic gender violence against the woman as a means of maintaining the patriarchal order that has been called into question. Even if they claimed the contrary, the protests against Chavez's article by the Peruvian residents end up reinforcing the position of the Huancayan journalist, as they don't demand the right to sexual freedom of the Andean performer, but rather they deny it by attempting to turn her body into an immaculate one, only thus worthy of representing the community. If I am certain about something, I want to say that neither Daniel M. Chavez's article, The Passion of Flor Pucarina, is a personal pathology, nor is his heteronormative defense a naive, radical crusade. No, in both cases, it has to do with collective and corrective acts against an autonomous woman who poses a danger to the ruling gender order of Peruvian society," end quote. And on page 133, Professor Mendívil writes, quote, "As ironic as it seems, it will be exactly the convincing authenticity of Flor Pucarina as a real person, a musical person, and theatrical character that will make our singer turn white from furious sexist attacks 3 decades after her death," end quote. Professors, we have heard that music changes the hearts and minds of people, as when David serenades King Saul in order to pacify his violence. How is it that the reception of the musical persona of this Peruvian singer promotes violence and not peace, Professor Mendívil?
I would say music was always related to violence. When we think about sacrifice, for example, when we think on rituals, and when we think on war, war is always accompanied by music. We know military music, and music has different functions for the war, in order, for example, to encourage the soldiers, or to create a kind of belonging in the group. There are many forms to use music for violence, and as we know through the work of Susan Cusick, music is also used for torture, and in many contexts, music is really a bad form of power, because you cannot resist music. If you don't want to see something that shock you, you can close your eyes, but you cannot close your ears. We cannot escape from sound, and for this reason, music is I would say more violent, as, for example, pictures.
Wow. So Professor Auslander, I don't know if you want to jump in on that. Incredibly heavy theme. It makes me think immediately when Professor Mendívil said that of the, yeah, it's such a heavy topic, but it makes me think about, I believe, when the U.S. military was trying to oust, I think, a Nicaraguan president that they knew he hated hip hop music, and so they blasted it outside his residence 24 hours a day until he left.
Yeah, there was actually a small item in the news today in the U.S. about a guy who owns several stores, 7-Elevens in Texas, who is now blasting classical music outside his shop because there are too many homeless people congregated around. So to disperse them, he plays this music, which is certainly a kind of social violence. So yeah, absolutely. But I guess I would also be tempted to make a distinction between, or sort of the question of, because we're really talking about violent uses of music, which to my mind is not exactly the same thing as asking whether music itself promotes violence, right? Which
Yeah.
seems to me to be a slightly different question. And I believe, now I don't know anything about the particular case we're talking about, so I don't want to say anything stupid, but I also think that sometimes the violent response or strong negative response is really more to aspects of the performer's persona than to the music per se, right? So I think that might be another kind of distinction that's worth making.
Okay. And
Yeah.
before Professor Mendívil comes in, I'd like to read what John van der Weert writes. Again, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. While I agree that music has been used to perpetuate systems of violence, including ideological in nature, calling music violence depends on subjective readings. How can you ascribe objective violence without coming to terms with the subjective usage of music rather than the objective teleology of music? Professor Mendívil, over to you.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with Professor Auslander. I wanted to say that music was always used in violent contexts. For me, music doesn't have intrinsic meaning, and music doesn't have I would say, a natural goal. We use music for different purposes, and for this reason, music could be used in order to bring people together, but music can also use in order to destroy persons, for example, in Tartar context, you know.
Okay, so moving on to our third roundtable. Was Beethoven wrong? What is the legacy of Western classical music in the Andes? The description of this episode of Vienna Live mentions Beethoven's use of Schiller's Ode to Joy in his Ninth Symphony, in which it is inferred that music transforms all men into brothers, yet that may not have been the case when European colonizers introduced Beethoven's music to their colonies in the Andes. To that end, on page 116, Professor Mendívil introduces the reader to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights definition of gender stereotyping, which reads in part, quote, "Gender stereotyping refers to the practice of ascribing to an individual woman or man specific attributes, characteristics, or roles by reason only of her or his membership in the social group of women or men. Gender stereotyping is wrongful when it results in a violation or violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Examples include not criminalizing marital rape, perceiving that women are the sexual property of men, and failing to investigate, prosecute, and sentence sexual violence against women, believing that victims of sexual violence agreed to sexual acts as they were not dressing and behaving, quote unquote, modestly, end quote. Then Professor Mendívil reveals the deeply personal connection to his research on pages 138 through 139 of the body of Flor Pucarina, writing, and this is again my translation from the original Spanish, quote, "I must confess that one of the reasons that motivated me to write these lines was exactly the perception that in this dispute, the body of Flor Pucarina functioned as a kind of linguistic sign expressing a racialized and culturally stratified collective as Andean. As a Peruvian migrant in Europe and a constant traveler in and around Latin America, I know what that means. I too, independently of how Western my upbringing was and how much influence I now hold in the culture I was raised in, today, to a stereotypical white European or Latin American, I am transformed into a sign, into a so-called quote unquote cholo, or mixed or body of mixed race that is violently separated from its individual subjectivity in order to be reduced to a collective identity, a product of racial orders and genders external to my choice. How can I not feel, then, that the humiliations of Flor Pucarina are not humiliations of me, too? How can I not feel in solidarity with her fate?" End quote. So, professors, was Beethoven wrong? What is the legacy of Western classical music in the Andes? Professor Mendívil?
I can suppose that you mean Beethoven as a representative for the Western music. And I would say that not everything was wrong with Western music in America. We have a lot of musical genres which are based on music from Europe, and we play a lot of European musical instruments in Latin America. For example, I play a kind of ukulele called charango, and this is a kind of Renaissance guitar which we use in the Andes. But of course, the presence of different musical culture, and of course, due to the power relationship between the colonizers and the colonized cultures, there was a hierarchy between the music from Europe and the traditional music in the Andes. But I would say that this is not always a negative influence, because when you receive inputs from the dominant culture, you are also able to transform it in a new thing. And this is happening in Latin America. We have a lot of musical traditions which combine musical forms or musical instruments or musical concepts from Europe and indigenous people in Latin America. And I would say this was a good thing that it happened, and I enjoyed this music, and I am very happy that I can play this music, but concerning to this idea of the body, what I see is that, as Christina Thomas says, when we play music as non-Western people, many persons expect on us that we play in a racial way. If I am a Peruvian guy, I have to play like a Peruvian guy, and I have to play Peruvian music, and I don't know, And in this case, I think the power relationship between the North Atlantic and the Global South are very clear, and many persons demand on us that we perform a kind of authenticity, playing traditional music or playing Latin American music. For example, many people ask me if I can dance salsa because I come from Peru, or if I can think Mexican songs like Cielito Lindo, because I come from Latin America, you know, and these kind of cliches we have are silly in a way, but they also have consequence in the real life. You know, I know a lot of people here in Europe, for example, African person who studied philosophy, and they don't get a job as philosophers because everyone expects that they play djembe, you know. And this is a big problem for someone who is interested not in music, not in drumming, but in other interests, you know.
And Professor Mendívil, before I get to Professor Auslander, in the case of Flor Pucarina, this meant that her complete identity was raped, as you said. It was assaulted. It was taken away by both sides. She could not be herself.
The point is she had to be not the woman she wanted to be, but the woman the author expected she has to be.
Okay.
And this is the problem.
Professor Auslander?
Oh, no, I can't add anything to that. That was, I think did a great job. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Okay. So let's open it up to questions then. Who would like to ask? We have these extraordinary professors with us, all in the same place. Are there any questions? Would anyone like to write something in the chat room or make a comment? Just turn on your microphone. I know Christina Thomas has a lot of thoughts on the issue. So does John Vonderveld. We haven't heard from some of the other guests. Please speak up. Don't be shy. Maybe also Professor Rivera might be willing to come in and say something. No comments. Well, I guess everything has been completely answered then. Any more comments then, Professor Mendívil, about this? What do you can you tell us about this collection of essays that you've just published, in which you are the editor? It's called Identities, Leaderships, and Transgressions in Peruvian Music. That's my, again, translation from the original Spanish. Tell us about this collection of essays. You're the editor, a co-editor, and you're also one of the essayists. Tell us about this and why you've published it now.
This book is an answer to I would say Raul Romero and I was discussing which kind of studies we miss in the Peruvian musicology. And then we make a list, a kind of desiderata, which topics we consider really important for the musicology in Peru, and then try to organize a compendium with different authors writing about all these topics. For example, about the LGBT community in Peru, but also, for example, there are many many studies about traditional music in Peru, but a big issue in Peru is, for example, art music or European influence art music in Peru. And we organize this book calling for different colleagues who write about all these topics. Art music in Peru, for example, also Jarabi. This is a very popular musical genre in Peru, and or rock music in Peru, for example, and also some kinds of topics like traditional forms, which are popular now and which came in the musical industry. And we got a publisher, the Catholic University in Lima, and the book came in December, the last year. It's really, really new, yeah? And you can order it in Amazon. I think the next month the ebook is circulating in internet.
Fantastic. So we have a question now. Fantastic. We have two. We have one from John van der Veld. It is, quote, while I agree, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Here it is. Within the Peruvian context, I'm curious as to the influence of Western composers upon the contemporary music scene. Are artists fitting the European mold or changing the European mold for the Peruvian scene? Which way does the influence flow? Thank you for your question, John van der Veld. Professor Mendívil.
Of course. I have to say that every University of Music in Peru was founded by Germans or by Italians. And if you can imagine, Germans brought the instrumental music tradition from Germany and the Italian opera. And we have in Peru, since the 19th century, a lot of composers who compose using the principles of art music in Europe. But before this process, from the beginning of the colonial time until the first University of Music around the end of the 18th century and in the 19th, 20th century, all the music in Peru, the music education in Peru was in the hands of the church. It means every Indian person who wanted to learn music learned music in the church, playing Catholic music, European music, and playing European instruments. It means we have a very strong tradition or a very strong connection with the musical traditions in Europe. The European were 300 years in Peru, and it's has traces, you know. And now there is a very big scene from contemporary music composers who use avant-garde styles, for example, and electronic devices in order to compose music. We have a lot of composers who are mixing Peruvian traditions with European, but we have also a lot of composers who only repeat what composers in Europe or in America do.
Okay, so we have now a question or comment from Professor Lino Rivera of St. Mary's College of California. Hi, Lino.
Yes, hello. It just I just remembered that I am a participant in this particular organization. It's called Musicians for the World, which was founded by a Peruvian violinist. And it teaches mainly classical music to young kids over there, and they already had some concerts that happened there. I'm just wondering what the reception is in terms of classical music in Peru as compared to the perception of Peruvians to their own indigenous music. And just to piggyback this with my own experience in the Philippines, I'm Filipino, we tend to look and idealize the Western concept, the Western tradition, the Western music, the Western style of fashion. And then the traditional indigenous music is kind of, well, it's not so advanced and developed, and so we tend to look down upon those. So I was wondering, what is the temperature, shall we say, in terms of Peruvian perception of classical music and indigenous music?
Yeah, I would say that it is the same in Peru. We have this idea that Western classical music is the higher development of music in the world. But I would say that only elite listen to this music. or consume this music. Normally, the people consume popular music, but even these people who don't like classical music think that classical music is better than the popular music. And this is a kind of coloniality which remain in the country, and it has to also to do with a very important fact that all universities of music teach music using the European art music as model. We learned, for example, to read a score, and we learned the European harmony, and we learned the European music theory, and we don't know normally what the indigenous people play. For example, when I was 18, I discovered traditional music from Peru, and I fell in love with the music. But before, I didn't know the music of my country, because I heard all the time, or I consume popular music from the USA or UK, and popular music from Latin America. And this is very common in Latin America. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to mention that we have the great, exorbitant privilege of having, again, Professor Auslander next week. And so he will be back. And I'd like to, for now then, ask for final thoughts, first from Professor Auslander and then from Professor Mendívil.
I don't know. So much has been said. But I guess I would just like to say that I'm very happy that my work has proved to be useful to Professor Mendívil, and I'm very interested in the particular context in which he's brought it, and the particular uses he's made of it. And I'm flattered and grateful that it's proving to be useful to other people.
Professor Mendívil?
I would say I'm very grateful that I can use input from a colleague from the whole world, and thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation with colleagues.
Okay, so let's see how we can stay in touch with Professor Mendívil and Professor Auslander. Here is Professor Mendivil's website at the University of Vienna. I will put this in the chat room. So there is your email and phone number, Professor Mendívil. People can just write to you or call you if they have questions or comments. Okay, fantastic. And then we have Professor Auslander here. Here is his website at Georgia Tech. And I believe we have an email address right there. People can reach out to you with their questions, Professor Auslander.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So let's see again. So I will put this is here in the chat room, Professor Mendivil's information, and I will put Professor Auslander's as well in the chat room. Here it is. So feel free to reach out to them with your questions or comments. I want to, and also as Professor Mendívil mentioned, so the book, Identidades, Liderazgos y Transgresiones en la Música Peruviana, my translation, Identities, Leaderships, and Transgressions in Peruvian Music, has already been released. It will be available on Amazon soon. So just type in Julio Mendívil and it will come up, sure, very shortly. Thank you very, very much to Professor Julio Mendívil and to Professor Philip Auslander.
Thank you to you.
So let's take a look at what's coming up next week. Again, as I mentioned, we have the great privilege of, again, having back Professor Philip Auslander once more. And the title of the program is Philip Auslander, Performance in a Mediatized Culture. Screens. At one time, their sole purpose was to shield one's private life from public glances. Now, screens are the omnipresent medium through which we spend an astonishing part of our private lives viewing public, quote-unquote, performances. The same multimedia distribution and recording technology that first permitted us to, quote, go to the theater in our slippers and pajamas, aka the home theater, has ended up reconstituting our understanding of live performance. For example, whereas multimedia performance first attempted to televise the experience of a live theater performance, the theater performance now tries to emulate the screen experience. So why do all these live performances now kowtow to the screen? Because if it doesn't look like the screen, we don't perceive it to be truly live. And why does any of this even matter? Because the screen subtly takes control of our reality while not permitting dialogue or even exit. I mean, who leaves their most intimate space because they don't agree with what they see on their smartphone? Small wonder then that advertisers pay exorbitant fees to get onto our screens. Hyperreality, as one theorist calls it, is a force that humanity has yet to come to terms with and may be a cultural challenge in need of urgent attention. Philip Auslander, professor of performance studies and popular music at Georgia Tech, knows the perils of the screen better than anyone else. He first published his research on this phenomenon in Liveness, Performance in a Mediatized Culture during the television era, and now, in the middle of the smartphone era, has just released the book's 3rd edition. Come welcome Philip to our show, and he will be our guide to understanding how the screen usurped reality. Again, that's Philip Auslander, Performance in a Mediatized Culture. That is next Wednesday. Once again, thank you so very much to Professor Julio Mendívil and to Professor Auslander. Thank you very much to Professor Lino Rivera, to Agnieszka and Benoit Rivolet for their support of this show. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants, for making it all worthwhile. From Vienna, Austria, New London, New Hampshire, Atlanta, Georgia, and the Bay Area, California, goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.